Yeah.
feelings and all. I whenever so what we do whenever feel like जैसे आज अगर mood है ना backpack किया चला दो हिल. We just go to hills.
Wow.
Himachal या फिर Uttarakhand. I drive a lot to hills.
Amazing, ma'am. I
Mama
think
love.
one of the best things I
इमरान ब्रेकफास्ट दे दो फटाफट एक पराठा तो खा
नहीं,
लो
आप खा लीजिए ना।
बनना
You know,
The best thing I love about BLA department is
what's world clock? It's 9:47 a.m. only.
yes, my dear. So do you think it should be more than that?
Yeah, I thought it was 1 a.m.
1 a.m. is in the night. You mean 1 p.m. in the day?
Yeah,
No.
I don't know why did I say a.m. I thought it was 12 a.m.
Really? No, my dear.
I don't think it was 12 p.m. I wanted 12 a.m. The night 12 a.m. Where is mine?
अभी आएगा पहले हम लोग खा लेते हैं हम लोग का क्लास है हाँ अनु दीदी दे देंगे अभी आपको बना हुआ है
मेरी भी तो क्लास का टाइम होगा
आज कौन सी क्लास ड्रामा ड्रामा
10:15 को होती तो है मेरी क्लास
अभी ना दीदी देंगे
मेरी क्लास का भी टाइम होने वाला है 10:15 किसको कौन सा कप चाहिए ले लो
किसी को भी कोई भी कप
किसको कितनी चाय चाहिए ले लो
समथिंग लाइक परमिशन चाहिए ज्वाइन करने के लिए मैं देख रहा हूँ मेरा ज्वाइन हुआ कि नहीं होना तो नहीं चाहिए ऑफिशियल आईडी के पास
हो गया हो गया जोइन क्या
लेकिन मैं खाना खा के ही जाऊंगी उधर so Anu is she's a life manager for us
Acha.
yeah she comes in morning 9 and she remains here till 7
Okay. With Arohi when you are in college, huh?
Anu didi will not come tomorrow na
Sunday she doesn't come but she's amazing like पूरा ना सब कुछ मैनेज वही करती है all household works I mean I always tell her तेरे बिना मेरा क्या होगा which is very good
बहुत अच्छा बनाया है।
the mint is from our own garden I grow some of the vegetables मेरे को पराठा ले लो और बैठ जाओ बेटा दीदी से लेके आओ ना so the YouTube thing is started 10 only or it started
कर लिया मैम
Mindy was very anxious कि ना कैसे होगा अगर कॉलेज से नहीं हुआ राकेश नहीं है so then she told me इमरान से बात करें मैंने कहा then you relate इमरान से बात हो गया तो don't worry she's very perfectionist
दीदी मैम हाँ
a
बहुत
lot to learn from her
मैंने हिंदी मैम को बोला आप टेंशन मत लो हो जाएगा इट्स नॉट अ बिग डील
थोड़ा सा I mean कई बार हो ना उसके perfectionist के साथ उस क्वालिटी के साथ एडजस्ट करने में मुश्किल हो
मुश्किल
जाता
होता
है
है
but at the end I regard her
बट
मेरा
यू आर द टीआईसी राइट नाउ है ना मैम
This is the senior most in our department.
I'm starving
इतना ड्रामा रोही कहाँ से मिला ये लो Did you pray food से पहले first pray कर लो फिर देती हूँ अब ना अपना जान जान के बोल रही हूँ।
सच में
इमरान एक पराठा और ले
ना
आए,
ना ना
ठीक से खा लो फिर।
नहीं नहीं माँ
अरे बना हुआ है ना, अरे एक पराठा दे देते हैं। हाँ, एक पराठा दे दे उसे।
are you also aware about my eating appetite
हाँ, ठीक ठीक है, हम बता रहे हैं।
आज नहीं ले रहे हो।
In terms of breakfast, I don't think much. Huh? I eat whatever I want to, but
Okay.
then I'm very mindful of
lunch
dinner.
अच्छा डिनर
Lunch भी ठीक ठाक खा लेती हूँ।
डिनर हम भी बहुत ज़्यादा मतलब वो
मम्मी इसको
इलेबोरेट
ऊपर मत
करते हैं
रखना।
Dinner थोड़ा सा कम खा लो, but breakfast तो अच्छे से खा लो, ठीक होता है।
हमारा यूजुअली ये होता है कि कश्मीरियों का कि लंच डिनर ना बहुत ज़बरदस्त इलेबोरेट करेंगे which sometimes becomes counterproductive as well दीप्ति एक बार देख लो ये चल रहा है क्या हाँ देख लो प्लीज ठीक ना ठीक है बॉस हाँ गुड टू गो ओके डियर ओके डियर ओके डियर
To whom were you talking?
Hmm?
To whom were you talking?
दीप्ति,
one of our colleagues do you know Deepti
दीप्ति दीदी मेरे साथ पढ़ाती हैं। So I have this habit of, so in her school, they call all the teachers, बैठा भी दिला देंगे इनमें।
कोई नहीं
So all the teachers, they call दीदी भैया।
क्यों ना चलो अपना दीदी का बर्थडे आना था।
चलो आ गए ना। So they don't call any of their teachers, even if they are 60 or 80 years old, ma'am. They call them didi and bhaiya. So Aravi goes to this alternative school. You can think about your kids, but थोड़ा सा
Hi Anuradha, nice to see you.
Hi, Nidhi. Do I see you? Like, can I see you? Like,
That's
just a
what
second.
it is.
Is your camera on?
No, I'm hiding.
Should I keep it on or can I also hide?
You can hide till Padma
Okay,
finishes.
fine. I mean, till Padma finishes. After that, I should be. Basically,
Your camera.
I'll be sharing a like a
Did you
PPT.
close
And
it?
if you want me to keep the camera window on, or should I keep it off? Like, what's preferable?
Whatever way it's comfortable for you, Anuradha.
Comfortable is off, obviously.
Okay, okay. But when you're speaking, then
I am
switch it on.
sorry
Speaking in the sense when I'm like sharing the
Yeah, yeah.
slides. Fine.
you
Sure.
want what
All the best to all of
Hi
us.
Vishnu. Yeah, hi Anuradha.
हाँ ना
Hi Vishnu.
कोई नहीं
Vishnu,
it's
you are on mute.
absolutely fine ma'am please
Hello. Nice to see you. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hi Linda. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
camera off yes
So we had more than 200 registrations. We are also trying to go YouTube Live. So the YouTube Live link is also being shared with people. That is why we had this delay in sending the meet link across.
What are you doing in this? Do you want to see your camera? So you switch it. You switch your camera.
स्विच ऑन करना है
नहीं, switch.
हाँ
टच क्लिक कर दो, आपका भी आ जाएगा.
not needed
आप खुद को देख लोगे.
not needed
Why? मैं तो हमेशा खुद को ही देखती रहती हूँ.
So we had more than 200 registrations.
But even YouTube, everybody can see that also. Look, Mama, when you on your camera. Okay.
Is there an option for me to put this somewhere because it's also recording the event? But I put it there, but we'll talk here, huh? My baby. Beta, just wait for me.
Hi, Padma. Welcome. Hi, Padma. Welcome. Nice to see you. Nidhi. I'm Nidhi speaking. Padma, you are unmuted. I can't mute you, so nobody can mute you. Just speak something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes,
Are
yes.
you able to hear? I can't hear
Yes.
you, Nidhi.
You can't hear me. Oh. Is there a problem? Have you joined with the computer internet?
Hello? Hello, can you hear now? Ah, good. Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, okay, welcome. Thank you so much for accepting the invite. And People are so excited to listen to you.
I can't say how less prepared I feel at the moment. This morning has been a disaster. So,
Padma, it's a lifetime of preparation.
no, that's too very, very indulgent of you. But
Not at all. Not at all.
yeah.
I'm just going to mute myself before the anchor takes on. The principal is here, Dr. Geeta Trilokumar, Professor Geeta Trilokumar, and all the other invitees are also here. Padma, she's also been a Commonwealth Fellow, and she also has several research projects to her credit. Welcome, ma'am.
Yes, nice to meet you, Professor Trilokumar.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I've been traveling since 4 a.m., so not very presentable, but I decided I'm going to join from the car.
Thank you for joining us, ma'am.
No, I'm very honored to be invited to participate in this. I found it difficult to stay home.
That is really nice of you, ma'am. So I think we can also begin the program shortly. It is the time when we plan to begin. So a very good morning to all those who have joined us today. I welcome you all to the workshop on studying schools, ethnography, and methodological concerns, organized by the Department of Elementary Education, Institute of Home Economics, in collaboration with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of the institution. The BLED department runs a 4-year professional undergraduate program of teacher education. And throughout this program, we work closely with schools and interact with school students, and also attempt to understand the school as an educational and social institution. Today's workshop is an attempt towards learning to study and understand schools through theoretical insights and sharing of field experiences by our speakers. We have with us Professor Padma Sarangpani from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, Dr. Anuradha Sharma from Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi, Dr. Vishnu Mishra from National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, and Ms. Linda Lewis from St. Teresa's College. We also have participants from various universities, institutions, and colleges of Delhi, and I think there are some from other states as well. So without doing any further delay, we will now begin today's workshop. For this, I will like to invite the teacher in charge of Department of Elementary Education, Ms. Sharmila Rathi, to welcome everyone, and to also invite the Director of Institute of Home Economics, Dr. Geeta Trilokumar, to welcome our speakers for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepti. I welcome all of you, all the speakers, our esteemed director, Geeta ma'am, who has been in quite a difficult schedule, but, is always there whenever any of the event, our department organize. This workshop is something our department was looking forward since long, and Nidhi, Deepti, and Aruna put a lot of efforts to, bring very, very good speakers for this workshop, which is going to be beneficial to the students as well as researchers and even professionals like us who are working in schools. So we are really looking forward to this event today. And now I request Geeta ma'am to kind of inaugurate the workshop and kind of say a few words, to motivate our students and other participants.
Thank you, Sharmila. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Good morning to everybody. On behalf of the Institute of Home Economics family, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the guest speakers and resource persons, faculty, and all the students present. I would actually like to congratulate the BLED department for picking up a very contextually relevant topic, I would say, for a workshop, because it's important to understand the difficult issues that face ethnographic research, especially in education. While I'm not a qualitative person, my research is completely quantitative. I know that while ethnography can produce a very valuable and relevant knowledge, it's really important to reflect on some of the issues regarding equality and other aspects. And it's good that you're organizing this workshop in context to education. Without much ado, I'd like to hand over the stage to the department to inaugurate the workshop. And congratulations once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Dipti, I request you to take over now.
Yeah, just a moment. Thank you, Professor Geeta Trilok Kumar, and I will take the program forward. And for that, I will invite Ms. Aruna from our department to share a short concept note and introduction to this workshop, after which we will have our speakers. We'll have the stage for our speakers. Thank you. Aruna, over to you.
Aruna, you are on mute.
A very good morning to everyone. I will now briefly introduce the concept, purpose, and objectives of today's workshop. In the time of COVID pandemic, when all the educational institutions are closed, schools have become all the more conspicuous by their absence. Children are all at home relying on their technical devices for otherwise usual classroom lessons. Needless to say that they are missing and wanting back their conventional schools. Our BLH students recently completed their internship practicum with various schools in online mode. And when asked for their reflections on teaching in this new system, they all shared a nostalgia for the need for a real unmediated interaction with learners. School spaces, if everything else, were indeed spaces for human interaction. This workshop does not, however, wish to get into the debates of technology versus conventional modes. Neither does it aim to discuss what is falling short. It is rather a recap exercise into our modes of investigation of schooling processes. Researching school has always been a challenging exercise. And the reason being that, at one level, everyone seems to be more than familiar with what happens in schools. And on the other, there are obscure ways in which schools function. Scholars like Prema Clark, Meenakshi Thapan, Nita Kumar, Padma Sarangapani, Shalini Advani, Veronique Bene, and many others have undertaken this dual challenge through their ethnographic studies of schools. These studies reveal deep insights about shared worldviews, norms, values, and attitudes that shape schooling processes. In stark contrast to policy-driven, non-immersive research studies that adopt a fragmented approach to understand various facets of schooling processes, ethnographic studies, apart from bringing out nuances, also point at important questions that researchers need to identify. Deeply nuanced worldviews of children, their complex interaction with teachers, and various other forms of communication with their peers pose difficult questions about the methodological frameworks for researchers as well as practitioners. At the same time, there are questions related to teachers' epistemological beliefs, their own identities, their location in socially hierarchical world, and how that gets communicated via school. And finally, the centrality of knowledge construction. What are the ways in which the questions of knowledge construction can be posed? How do anthropological tools help in understanding the process of knowledge construction that is crucial to the experience of schooling? With these questions, today's workshop is aimed at deepening the understanding of ethnography as a method of inquiry into the field realities of school. It is an important aspect of teacher preparation to build theory-praxis connections. Students of teacher education bring interesting insights from the field, but need conceptual know-how to build these insights to be able to strengthen their praxis. The expertise of the teachers need not be defined pedagogy, but they need to be empowered to tackle the aforementioned complexities of educational processes with purpose, direction, and agency. These broad objectives, this workshop seeks to provide a platform for interaction between young researchers, students of educational studies, practitioners, and field experts who have done scholarly contribution to the field of school ethnography. The workshop would have 4 sessions. The first session is led by Professor Padma Sarangpani, who would present a self-reflexive talk from her wide and rich experience of the field of school education. This workshop draws a great deal of motivation from her ethnography of a village school that got published as her most celebrated and pioneering school knowledge. In the second session, Dr. Anuradha Sharma would illustrate how ethnography as a method helps us capture the social and pedagogical dynamics in understanding identity formation within schools. She will be talking about meanings of schooling that emerge in everyday practices of school education, drawing from her renowned work called School Worlds. In the penultimate session, Dr. Vishnu Mishra will share his insights on the challenges of in-depth ethnography of community participation school in Western India. He emphasizes on the problems of reconstructing innovative teaching learning programs in rural settings of Western India. And in the final talk, Ms. Linda Therese will highlight some pitfalls in the path of ethnographic work, including lack of reference to theory and history, the focus on micro level, the taken for granted nature of everyday life, and the constant need for reflexivity. Lewis draws upon works and personal insights with regard to the study of higher educational settings. We welcome our eminent speakers to share their most valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Aruna, for this detailed introduction to the workshop. I now invite Dr. Nidhi on the stage. Dr. Nidhi, I invite you to please introduce our...
Yeah, I'm here, Deepthi. I'm just doing housekeeping as well. Welcome, everybody. It's only me who stands between Professor Padma Sarangpani and you all today. She is the chairperson of the Center of Excellence in Teacher Education. She has had various initiatives in school and teacher education at national and international levels. I counted more than 20 publications, more than 10 reports, 22 research projects, several recognitions and awards, including a Fulbright, a Commonwealth Academic Fellowship, a UNESCO King Hamdad bin Isa Al Khalifa Prize for the use of ICT, which is so fascinating, the Indira Gandhi Memorial Fellowship, the UGC SAP Fellowship, and 22 projects funded by variously by Tata Trust, MHRD, ICSSR, DART Germany, TASE, British Council, UKD. I don't think that there's anything else that can be said by Professor Padma, and I'm not going to say it at all. We are so honored to have you here and just looking forward to listening to you. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you, Nidhi, for such a kind introduction. I'm really very pleased to be in this group. When Anna asked me, my first response was to try to find a way to say yes, because I don't get many chances to interact with the BLF community, and I'm deeply attached to this community. So an occasion to do this was very, very difficult for me to set aside. So here I am today. I must apologize. The morning has been a bit of a calamity, and I don't feel fully prepared. So you will please indulge me in this next half an hour when I'm making a valiant attempt to pull my thoughts together and say something coherent. Please forgive me if my reflections don't quite meet your expectations, but I'm happy to interact and answer questions if they should come up. I am taking the liberty to be a little bit reflective in this exercise, although I should confess that I'm fed up of reflexivity as a mode of being. Very often I find that ethnography becomes more about the researcher than the researched, because there is this endless reflexivity in which we deal with our own self and our own assumptions and beliefs, even as we try to engage with the field. And while reflexivity is a very important ethical stance, honestly, today it is beginning to become a bit oppressive in understanding objects of inquiry, as we become more and more aware of the dependency between the observer and the observed. The qualitative turn, we might say, in educational research, and out of the names that Aruna mentioned, only Prema Clark and I probably come from mainstream education faculties, faculty dealing with educational work of teacher education or education development. We don't come into this, haven't entered into qualitative and using ethnography from other disciplinary trainings, whether they come from sociology or anthropology, but very much emerging from our overall disciplinary socialization into teachers and teaching, teacher education especially being the overriding disciplinary ethos. The field of educational research, in its search for theoretical moorings, largely drew from history and psychology in order to build, in order to anchor the discourse of the discipline and understanding of the discipline itself, and also informing the way in which the questions we begin to ask questions and research them. Because teacher education itself was seen largely as a matter of knowing what you need to do and figuring out how to do it. And that figuring out was very much left to methods and techniques, and not really even problematized as researchable questions. At best, psychology was able to problematize questions of the classroom and questions of method. And during the phase in which education was forming as a discipline, psychology itself was largely a quantitative research method. And that's how the work in education actually grew around the techniques that psychology has brought and offered to education. And somewhere around the 90s, largely because of what was happening in new sociology of education and being brought into the Indian context by people like Meenakshi Thapan, who engaged with education faculty at Delhi University, some of us actually began to look at qualitative methods as an entry point into researching education. And I have to say that my journey of learning, I thought that it was as difficult and complex as it was, because I was among the very few attempting this method and also struggling to figure out what it was, with very few exemplars to follow. At best, we had the works of David Woods and others coming out of the new sociology of education tradition to inform the way in which we approached ethnography. Intuitively, in the words that Aruna herself has described, it seems intuitively the right thing to do, because entering into the life worlds of the school seems to be the most important thing to understand in educational work. And it is also deeply motivating and empowering to feel that one has engaged with the life world. And it also seems to be the ethically important thing to do, to engage with the world of students and teachers. And when I began my work as well, the mode that was forming at that time was one of a moral high if one adopted ethnography. It was almost as if qualitative people had missed the true nature of the game. They were all really blinded by qualitative methods. They were lost in methodology and not really engaging with subjects and research. There was also this notion that, it produces very fragmented knowledge while the school is holistic. And, we need to understand the whole. We can't get into these fragmentary parts. And many of the terms that Aruna has also used, fragmented, non-immersive, these are not just descriptive terms, right? They are carrying a moral judgment that something which is fragmented is less good than something which is holistic. So the minute you start describing ethnography as being holistic and worldview oriented, while quantitative is fragmented and non-immersive, in your mind you begin to form this notion that, quantitative is really the game of those who really can't engage with or qualitative, or they haven't really understood that this is the real thing. And if we don't go down the qualitative path, then we're really going to miss the true nature of reality. And willy-nilly, I would say, over the last 3 decades, this kind of um, um, judgment over the two uh, methodological options has grown. In fact, even when we read positivism, we start associating it with an older form, slightly more stupid form. Oh, it works for the powerful, it works for the elites. While the qualitative seems to be immersed in the world of the and the subjective worldviews of human agents themselves, and it seems to be more true to the human condition as compared to the quantitative. As you can guess from the way I'm narrating this dichotomy, that I have really begun to question this. And I also feel that it is very naive for us to assume that these two are somehow, that the one is missing the point, while the other one is more true to the point. And I want to problematize that a little bit, both from my own experiences and the experiences of my students. I want to especially draw attention to the, the deep difficulties in getting the qualitative method right and finding something important to say using a qualitative method, and also beginning to draw your attention to why quantitative methods too are important and how to make all methods better. I mean, you can have bad ethnography, inadequate, poor, deficient ethnography, and qualitative research, just the way you can have poor quantitative research. And you can have good ethnography the way you can have good quantitative research. And I think I would really, really encourage all of us in education to take this view and this approach, rather than juxtaposing the two as somehow two incompatible views of the world. The the couple of difficulties that I experienced as a qualitative researcher, I should put out here, um, and they're partly documented in my book. And I have repeatedly gone through the same cycle as I have worked with my students. So I want to put that up front, even as I will then reflect on what works and how to make it work. The What I found myself experiencing, and I find again and again my students experiencing, is that the field is overwhelming. And when you take on the task of being a thick researcher, doing thick description, of course, there is the one problem of learning how to describe and not judge, which is extremely difficult because language is inherently synthetic and inherently enables us to make judgments. And we're carrying our ability to make judgments, which is a very important human ability, into the field. And learning to be able to describe is a very, very difficult task. Maintaining thick notes is very difficult task. And what is even more important is having gathered all that note making, what to do with it next. And that's really the point at which I find the whole research cycle truly, truly gets challenged. And I've realized that the key difference between the qualitative researcher and the quantitative researcher is that for the quantitative researcher, a lot of reading, immersion in research, piloting and understanding of the field is a preparation which then leads to the development of an instrument with which you go into the field. And let's not forget that even any research needs research tools to be valid and reliable. In other words, if the quantitative researcher has not understood the nature of the field and engaged with it, the tool is actually going to be inadequate to the task of understanding the field. So you have to invest in that in order to develop your tools. And so the quantitative researcher is really doing a lot of preparation in advance, figuring out what are the questions for which I want answers, and then going into the field with tools to examine. While in the case of qualitative research, we seem to have the liberty of entering into the field with very ill-formed research questions. And then the real work of the research begins afterwards, after the data is gathered. And so this is a very, very major difference, that the real work of the qualitative researcher seems to begin after the data is gathered, while for the quantitative researcher, a lot of that investment of effort and time goes in advance to prepare you to the field. Now, it doesn't mean that a qualitative researcher somehow has the liberty to go into the field without preparation. In fact, I find often the whole narrative of qualitative researcher leads researchers to believe that I should not have any biases, so I should not read anything. I should go in and let this field speak to me. I find that absolutely stupid to hear. I have become totally impatient with this point of view because it's an extremely naive point of view. Probably the most insightful articulation I have heard about qualitative research is that there are no tools or instruments that a qualitative researcher takes into the field, but the self of the researcher is the research tool. We have to be the research tool. In other words, our ability to see should have been educated. Our ability to hear and record should be highly developed. And we develop this by reading extensively research about the problem that we are broadly interested in, about the field in which we're engaging, and similar other contexts. So there's a lot of prior preparation that has to go into the qualitative researcher as well, so that the self of the researcher now can act as the research tool. So we don't have a research interview schedule, but we have enough questions in our minds. We don't have an interview schedule to conduct a conversation, but frequently we have to come back and figure out what are the probes so that I'm going to be able to get people to talk. And that is something that I realized very early, and I was kind of starkly, this assumption of mine was starkly shaken when I went back to do ethnographic work with the Baika community, that as a qualitative researcher, I find we are heavily, heavily dependent on the willingness of our subjects to speak to us. And all our efforts is to get people to talk to us. Because it's not only enough to observe what people do, but we're also trying to get at their own views of why things are the way they are. And we want to really enter into their own worldviews and their constructions. So getting people to talk is very, very essential for a qualitative researcher. And figuring out how to do this is important. Now, this really worked for me when I was researching Kasimpur, and it works for my students who research qualitative communities. But when I was researching among the Baika tribal group, I found that this simply didn't work. It's a culture which is a very quiet culture. It's a culture, it's not a talkative culture at all. And there really this strategy that the qualitative researcher depends upon was truly, truly challenged. All those of you who will also research with children will find that getting children to speak is yet another very difficult problem. And in fact, we find very few good qualitative researchers that get into the worldview of children, because how to read, how to listen to children, how to make sense of what they're saying, how to relate children within the adult world in which they are located. I think these are much more complex issues and for us to deal with methodologically. So in any case, this preparation to enter into the field was quite a struggle. And learning to deal with the field notes that came afterward, I mean, that was really, really the main important challenge. And I find that it's not just that I dealt with it, but I find my students, all my students going through it. And this is something that I have realized I need to tell people in advance, that your real research is going to begin after you have your data. But at the same time, your data has to be so rich that it can answer the kinds of questions that you will want to ask after your research, after your fieldwork is done. You may go back to the field, but there's going to be no substitute for that immersive, deep field engagement. So that's something that one learns to do and has to do. And I've seen it repeatedly happening with my students. Now, the dealing with that data is actually an extremely taxing, difficult task, and it never becomes easier, no matter how much I I prepare my students for it, and no matter how much I've prepared myself to do it. Every time you do it, it's an extremely arduous task. The only comparison that I have for it is doing a tapestry. I don't know how many of you do needlework. I do needlework. And you can't achieve the tapestry, you will never finish it until you've put in every single stitch. And the bigger more ambitious your tapestry, the more stitches that you need to put in. And you need to have the grit to keep on and on. Now, putting stitches into tapestry is extremely meditative if you're feeling positive about it, and boring if you're feeling negative about it. And it's overwhelming to sit and do it every day, day after day. But that's absolutely essential. But then, most researchers find it difficult to distance themselves from the voices of their subjects and the experiences of their subject. Once they've got so immersed in it, distancing, standing back, and beginning to view this work from other lenses, being able to ask questions about what is being said is really very, very difficult. And there's just no solution for it. I mean, you have to somehow figure out what is the story I want to tell from this? What is the argument I want to make from it? And I have found that the only way we wrap our heads around it is through writing. So writing becomes the main tool that has to be developed. So in a way, it is different from quantitative research, because in quantitative research, it's almost as if writing comes as a way of reporting what you have found. So you set up the research, you go to the field with your questions, you gather your data, you analyze it, and then you have the answers, and then you write, how did I find my answers? And then you reflect on what my answers mean. What could they mean? But in qualitative research, the whole process of asking the question, in fact, even defining what does the question mean, how should it be posed, and what is the field telling me about this question, emerges through this process of analysis and writing, which go hand in hand. And it's extremely painful to write. So unless you are willing to sit stuck on the chair every day to chisel away at the work, the quantitative research simply doesn't come together. And there's just no easy way around it. In fact, I have increasingly found it important to distinguish between ethnography and qualitative research. And qualitative research is also important, but it could be scaffolded by many more tools that you bring into the fray. While ethnography is heavily dependent on the field researchers' field notes as the main source of data. And there's no simple way of getting around and sorting this out. In fact, for most researchers, this is a period of intense crisis. I don't know, I mean, maybe Anuradha will reflect and tell you whether she had an easier time with her data, but regardless, whether my students have produced great pieces of work or whether they have been produced manageable pieces of work, all of them have been through intense crisis of just figuring out how to make sense now, how to deal with this. Every time you get into the trying to analyze, you want to get into the details. So sacrificing detail now becomes the new name of the game. After the initial phase was all about getting the detail in, now it's about giving up detail, trying to look for bigger picture. And then many qualitative researchers say, oh my God, I'm doing things that quantitative researchers do. I'm looking for pattern. I'm actually enumerating. I'm looking for more and less. I'm beginning to use quantifiers, even if I'm not exactly counting. And I think that's like a moment of revelation. And having been through many cycles of working with students, I've realized that absolutely, just because you're a quantitative researcher or an ethnographer doesn't mean that you are any less analytic. And you can't be synthetic in a meaningful new way unless you're intensely analytic. You go through this analytic phase before being synthetic. Yeah. And the way you look at your data, the way you parse your data, break it up, episodize your data, these become the analytical lenses which eventually inform the way your thesis is written up. So the descriptors that are used, they all arise from the problematics of the field and the insight that we want to bring into understanding the field in describing and parsing the data. And I think this are really difficult things that we need to learn to deal with and have the grit to stay with in order to make this research work. So, we really need to give ourselves time to write and rewrite, because that is not just reporting your research, it's actually doing the analysis through the process of writing and rewriting. And that's where many of the things that you would have read about in your qualitative research methods courses, such as field categories, ethnographic categories, constructs, all these things really come into the fray, because these are the terms on which arguments get built, and these arguments link back to theoretical points of view. So we may not be using hypothesis and null testing, but we are still having hypotheses that we are investigating in our data. It's not like we are without hypothesis, without analysis. So actually, as you begin to immerse yourself in qualitative research, you find that the basic modes and modes of the research are very similar, regardless whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative. And you can be good at it or you can be bad at it. It's really not really different from each other. So in fact, in my recent work, what I've been doing is really trying to figure out ways in which to get these two to speak to each other more intimately. And I'd like to share with you some such method, a method that we kind of put together for a study we carried out a couple of years ago when we were investigating quality and private schooling, the low fee paying school quality problem. And what we wanted to bring into the method of the research is an understanding of quality, which is more conceptually grounded. And we also wanted to bring into the game observational tools that speak to conceptions of quality which link to the idea of educational worthwhileness. Now, most of us as people steeped in education, we feel we can judge an educational experience that is educationally worthwhile. And we can even find the terms to describe it. And we feel we can do it in one school, two schools. But if we want to talk about a schooling phenomenon, if I want to go into an educational block and look at 90 schools and say, what is the educational quality in these 90 schools? Can I create an observational approach, which I can use over 90 schools, not just in one school or two schools, but which is still richly informed by this kind of synthetic judgment and ability to see and grasp the nature of the educational process which is going on. Listen and talk to teachers, because qualitative research tells us that it's not enough for you to observe the classroom. You also need to speak to the teachers and understand what do they want to do with the classroom. So can we come up with a methodology for this? And I think we did. I mean, we still only took it over 90 schools in Hyderabad, but it's still a huge number if you stop to think about it. A purely qualitative description would not have worked. So we went into these schools with a detailed observational schedule. Many answers to these schedules could not be gathered by simply ask the question, get the answer, ask the question, get the answer. Rather, we had to build rapport with the school management, with teachers, observe in the classroom, just over 2 days. Try to grasp what is going on and render it into rich description. And then post facto, try to see whether there are patterns within which we can fit the observations. For example, even if we talk about space, can we remove the description of space from kacha building, pakka building, square footage area, and come up with descriptors that render our understanding of space valuable from the educational perspective? So, for example, we looked at crowding in the classroom and tried to understand what the crowding in the classroom was leading to. Where do children play? What is happening in the corridor? We try to render the description of the school into a vocabulary which enabled us to judge it from an educational worthwhileness lens. And we used a similar kind of approach to understanding at least 5 or 6 dimensions of quality, which we kind of abstracted out of work from Christopher Winch and J.P. Nayak. And I think that piece of research really, in my view, begin to give me more insights into what is happening vis-a-vis quality of education and social class of students who come to the school. So, for example, even with the social class of the school clientele, we had to use a quote-unquote a qualitative method to arrive at the social class of the school clientele. And it was largely based upon descriptions of occupations of parents which school heads gave us, and then we had to post facto categorize those occupations into some 5 occupational types. So you see that in order to push the quantitative research to speak more to the field, it's kind of heavily informed by the qualitative research. But to use qualitative research to talk about a phenomenon which is important to comment about because it must speak to policy, it must argue with some of the other kinds of research coming out to comment about school quality, we had to approach it from a qualitatively informed approach. And I find that this is a powerful method of really figuring out how to make the two methods speak to each other so that we get categories that are more contextually valid, that can be validated from the field. They have much higher field validity. But at the same time, we're also able to work with it in order to make some kind of quantitatively valid statements. Yeah, so that was one new recent methodological experiment that I wanted to speak to you about. The second one is to do with a methodology that one of my students is working with. As Nidhi mentioned to you, I've been involved with a large-scale field intervention called the Connected Learning Initiative, in which we're working with over 400 schools. We're working with teacher professional development and trying to transform the quality of classroom culture. Now, my student Bindu has been looking at teacher communities of practice, and she has established on mobile phones a lot of discussion among teachers, and there's huge amount of data coming from that. And the method that she's using is what is being described as quantitative ethnography. So what is the field? It is actually the data on the mobile. But it's informed by your understanding of the teachers as participants in it. And even as you work with the data that you're getting from the mobile, you are constantly engaging with it like you do as an ethnographic researcher, right? You read the data with hypotheses at the back of your mind, as well as what literature tells you, what you know about the worldview, and then you try to piece the argument together. But the fact that this is all digitized data enables us to also quantify it in order to examine whether the direction of our thinking is appropriate or not. So it is this kind of, it's like detective work. But it is detective work which takes advantage of some of the quantification techniques that big data use can enable us to do. Now, that doesn't mean, and you keep the complexity of the phenomenon always in your face. You're not going to reduce the complexity of the phenomenon. No, you're going to keep it and you're going to try to theorize with it, with the complexity of the phenomenon, but using data as well. This is really a very, very interesting and exciting new space which is opening up, which also shows us that, quantitative methods can be made to speak to complexity of the field and complexity of worldviews, and we can bring the two into closer interaction with each other. And so this is more of an example in which a quantitative method is being used to speak to a research study which is essentially a qualitative, while the earlier example was how a quantitative survey was deeply enhanced by bringing to bear on it basically a qualitative methodology. So at this point of time in my own journey as a researcher, that's more where I am today. I really am more in a state in which I'm looking for a good argument and thick use of data from multiple sources in order to investigate that argument with a keen detective eye on the constant skepticism that needs to be in the back of your mind and the asking for evidence for any claim that you make. Yeah? And we find very, very rich research being done both in the qualitative tradition as well as in the quantitative tradition with this kind of rigor introduced into how we go about doing research. So, yeah. So with these words, I'd like to stop and hand it back to Nidhi, Aruna, and colleagues at IHG.
Thank you so much, Padma. This is Nidhi speaking. It was a delight listening to this. So last week I was in this conference, which was the International Anthropology Conference, and there were some sessions on education. And I did attend some of the anthropology sessions as well. And I kept listening to the experience, the location, the dislocation of the researcher, how they feel the air, how field itself is tiring for them, and going to the field, especially if it is a conflict zone, or especially if it is a trauma zone, or especially if the place like a Tehri existed and doesn't exist anymore. So they're all talking so much about being in the field. So I absolutely found that echoing with your alertness to ethnography becoming more about the researcher. Thank you so much for saying that. Thank you also for bringing these dichotomies between the qualia and the quant, and opening up the layers of how both appear to approach the problem differently and argue different things, albeit your argument that quant and qualia both position and place the tools, the work, the iterative reading, writing at different times, looking at tools, positioning tools, and they place them at different times during the research process. And that's what's different, rather than so much of a dismissive stance towards quant. Thank you for alerting us. Thank you for alerting us that big data can bring out the complexity of the phenomena if it's made mixed, and bringing in qualitative methodology. Thank you for taking us through the research process. I'm sure all of our students would have learned a great deal about the question, the self as a research tool, reflexivity as a stance, dealing with data, analysis, writing, abandoning the god of detailing for the favor of small things, categorizing, making quantitatively valid and qualitatively sound problematizations. Thank you so much. And thank you also about talking about digital ethnography. This was a delightful session, and I'm not going to add any adjectives because none of them can, actually do any justice. If there are questions, would you like to take them?
Sure. I can, maybe. Yeah, sure.
So far, nobody's typed a question. So we can wait for 2 minutes if people want to unmute themselves. Sunita would like to speak. Sunita, just go on. Please unmute yourself and speak.
Hello, Padma ma'am. This is Sunita Mishra.
Yes.
So I have been her student from VLA times, and I loved your session as much as I used to love your classes. So thank you for this session. I have one very small question. And that is, like we have been talking about qualitative and quantitative. Would you say that the mixed methods approach that we talk about, is that a solution or is it just another fad?
Actually, I would say that it depends on the kind of question that we are being asked and also the time that we have on hand to answer the question. And I think it comes out of that. So I think mixed method is more like a signal for us to be open and not see things in dichotomies, and to kind of be open to the fact that the research problem, there may be things to be said and investigated in the research problem from both quantitative and qualitative paradigms. But I would say that, whether we adopt it or not is more a matter of time on hand. Let's also remember that a lot of the kind of research tasks that we are given to do are not research tasks that actually speak to theory building as a main activity. A lot of, as we get into the research process, especially after we finish our PhDs, we rarely have these research opportunities, once or twice maybe, but not all the time, where our research is directed towards the traditional theory building stance. We're actually quite frequently want to do situation analyses of the ground, and and we end up using a lot of quantitative research actually in these descriptors that we build, or at least, more basic qualitative researchers. We rarely get the opportunity to go back to the field as and in that, I think some mixing of some qualitative often becomes like creating those boxes in which you put in some field insight. It's rarely really taking mixed methods for the two methods to bear on each other in any fundamental way. Actually, if you look at the ethnographic work that even the early ethnographers of school were doing, they were doing a lot of they were actually doing mixed methods even within their ethnography. They were conducting surveys in the school, they were administering tools to participants, and they were using the data as well and knitting it into the argument that was being made. It wasn't like only pure participant observation of anthropologists. So in education, it seems that mixed methods is more, the educational contexts are more amenable to mixed methods, maybe, than, doing classical participant observation in communities. Then you really don't get opportunities to administer tools because the setting is not suitable for that kind of research tool. So I would hazard that that's the reason why we find mixed methods more in educational contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Manish, please unmute yourself.
Richi has a question. Let her go first, then I can go. She has typed it in the chat box.
Yeah. So I'll read out Richi's question. Richi is asking, if we use self as a tool in research, will the researcher's bias not affect the research process, and how can it be generalized then?
I think the researchers the self is always a tool, right? In quantitative research, it's just that you put out your questions and then you have other people validate it as well as the tool gets developed. But let's not forget that even how you ask that question affects the answer that you get. And so there's so much preparation even in a quantitative method on how you go about doing the research and gathering the data. So the self inevitably enters in, and stance of the self and all that affects research. I mean, there's no escape from that. Even somebody who was so intensively ethnographic and anthropological, like I've had the occasion to read a lot of Verrier Elvin's work because of my work with the Baika, and people have reflected post facto that maybe he got a lot of what he did because he was a white man in a tribal area field. So, I mean, how much of the self can you leave out? It's got to go in with you in the field. And I think that's really why the reflexivity discourse has so strongly come up in anthropology. It is this self-awareness. And that's the reason why we need to constantly present evidence for what we are seeing as well. So that's really what qualitative researcher then becomes about. And let's not also forget that qualitative research does not claim to produce generalizable truth. So it's not about generalizing an insight, but rather for an insight to find its validity or its relevance to other contexts. So you grasp the field and you generate insight, and others find your work insightful. You don't generalize. Yeah, but you can begin to see the parallels with other contexts. So if you actually see the vocabulary that is used when qualitative research is from one context is drawn to another, you will see that these are the kinds of terms that are used, not claims about generalizability. Geertz actually makes a very, very important point in his reflections on anthropology. He says that you don't research the field, you research from the field. And that's again a really, really important insight. Very often when you're in the field, the universe of your thinking is beyond the field. But the field really becomes the context to develop this larger sense of the human condition. It's not about just this here and now, but it's actually using this here and now to reflect on bigger ontological issues. And I have increasingly found that really anthropology and philosophy speak to each other very closely, because this is reflection on the human condition. When you make claims about human relationships, these are very deep ontological claims that have to speak to other cultures. So this anthropologist is more like a translator across cultures, making one ontological reality transparent for another. In fact, the researcher needs to translate across cultures. Even if it is your own culture, you're still translating across your own research, So that I think is inevitable. And we shouldn't worry about the question of bias.
Yeah, Manish, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, Padma. Actually, your response to this question was just has helped me sharpen. I hope has helped me understand my question all the more better. There are four things which I draw from your essay and response now, from your talk and response now. One is the reference to self, then field. Okay. In relation to this, I want to bring in two other elements. One is the idea of perspective, and another is of history, to which you had alluded. Now, often when we are thinking of self, I'll just take three, four sentences, not long. Often when we are thinking about self, one reference to culture which you have made and to one year Elvin's race itself says that a person is historically situated and is part of a cultural group. But then cultures itself pass through histories. So that's one. Second is this self is also, as you have indicated, is also not just culture but also social relations, positions, and power. Now, when this self enters a field from which we wish to understand ontological question, it is also assuming certain explanations about human relationships, about social structures. So my question, I have not done ethnographic work, is that on the one hand, from you want to understand field and from the field you wish to ask questions. But many people argue that just focus on the field, while others say that there are several other social structures, discourses, which are not directly visible, and but they are at work, whether you are talking of caste or class or other things, or in present situations of npm or the other things. Now, how does one make this connection in an ethnographic work between the larger forces with reference to the field from one is trying to, and not just make it simply an ideological perspective reduce things. So
Actually, one of the most complex things in my view about my ethnography is to speak the micro theorizing to the macro. That connect is really, really very, very difficult. And sometimes I even feel impossible. Even this claim that you will move from the micro to the macro and then will be more consistent and your ontology will be more true is, I think, a very complex claim, because I feel that the perspective of the macro has a different kind of construction as compared to the perspective of the micro. And the processes of the macro and the micro are not necessarily reflective of each other. I mean, it stands to reason that the macro must create the macro determines the micro process should reflect the macro, but I feel this link is actually extremely complex. In fact, if anything, I feel everything is moving in the direction of prompting us to be more fuzzy about these connects. And more we realize that the naming of these realities are constructs or proposals with their own power politics, which is playing out. So that's really complex. But I think as researchers, we can't place ourselves in this bucket or in that bucket. I think what I've worked with my students to say is, they come and tell me that, I know that it's a caste society, but I didn't see it in the classroom. I didn't see the caste playing out. I know this teacher is from XYZ social class and the children are from another social class, but I don't think caste was what was playing out here. And then I tell them, look, we have to ask that question, right? We cannot just say that I will name only things which come out from the field and caste never came out from the field, so I will not talk about it. No, you can't say that. You'll have to admit into your, this will have to become one of your questions that, how is it that I did not see caste? Although I know that caste is such an important um, characteristic of Indian society, and so many researchers have spoken about it in terms of caste. Either I make an argument that caste as a variable is not the relevant one for this particular analysis that I'm going to do, and I have to argue it and establish it, or I have to make an argument about where caste is and why it might not have been manifesting in this phenomenon at all. So I will have to still engage with some of these existing positions, debates, and then connect it with the field work that I'm doing. So, in that sense, as researchers, we cannot delimit our research problem to only what we think has emerged from the field. We will have to engage with the community and its discourse and be prepared with the kind of questions that will come and the kind of answers that we will make. So, that's really what I would have to say about some of how these might be interacting or how we actually handle or deal with it on the field. In addition to history, and I think that as ethnographers, we need to be invested with the history of the place. So, in other words, the phenomenon is not just in the here and now. And if we go into the field thinking that, I will be more tuned to my field if I just go with the here and now. And if my participants were not speaking about history, then what is the need for me to? If my participants seem to be living in an ahistorical moment, why should I know the history? You might really think like that. And I've realized that actually the everyday world is a very, very complex construct. In fact, many of the theories, they don't seem to the members of the everyday world. Seem to reside in one or two intellectuals, which may not even be a part of the community with which we're interacting. And the question might arise, do I really need to get into their intellectual history when it's not manifesting in their everyday life? And to me now, I begin to feel that really only the construct of culture helps us understand why it is relevant. Even all of us, in our own everyday, are we on a daily basis dealing with maybe not more than most of us seem to be living in a casteless situation. We're not really interacting with the quote unquote the fabric, intellectual fabric of our culture is not really hitting us in the day to day. Maybe it springs up at a death ritual or in a marriage ritual, but it's not a part of our everyday life. But to think that it's not therefore in our culture, I think is a big mistake. And right now I feel, thank God that idea of culture exists. It has the operational for understanding more complex construction of the everyday world and not restrict our understanding of the everyday world to the superficial interactional phenomenon that it seems to play out in an everyday way. In fact, the everyday world becomes available to us for observation only in moments of crisis and occasion. It's not really there in the routine everyday world. And that's something which is very, very difficult for us to deal with as qualitative researchers, because we may be spending days and days and days on the field, and there's just this one moment which really seems to be the important one. So there'll be reams and reams of field notes which are really just routine descriptions of the field. Nothing happens, you feel. And it's true. You're just hanging around with the people, and on a daily basis, you're making thick records, and it's really not rich with the kind of material that you will eventually work with. That comes your way once in a while, or when you get people to talk, or when there's something happens. But you need to hang around, for those moments to manifest. And that's why it becomes tiring and exhausting and time-consuming and extremely taxing, actually, to wait for those moments when actually you think culture plays out in those moments. Or we have to use other tools to make the field speak to us, or even this apparent everyday routinization. We have to kind of find a way of understanding how it comes about to be and how it gets established as an everyday routine. So really, that's the thing about qualitative research also. Many researchers get very impatient because of the immense boredom which it seems to have on the one hand. But at the same time, you can never let loose of the tension in your body because you have to be constantly alert in the field. Nevertheless, I don't know, all those of you who have done field work must have experienced it. Even 2 hours in the field is emotionally exhausting. And after that, you feel like you deserve a big treat and you need to sleep. You don't even feel like sitting at your desk and writing your notes because mentally and physically you feel so exhausted. We need to be enormously fit physically to handle the field, simply for this reason. So, Manish, that's a long answer to your short question.
Yeah, no. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Padma, our last speaker for today is Linda, who looked at a specific kind of an institution. And her argument today is this, she comes from anthropology, and the argument that she wants to make today is her reflections of anthropology and ethnography being divorced from or away or distant from history and from theory. So that is what she's going to speak on today. It's just sharing with you, so just remember. But Sharmila, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you, Padma ma'am. It was so interesting. In fact, whatever you were saying was taking me back to my field, which was again a kind of qualitative work in schools where I did a lot of participant observation and other work. So I could relate the anxieties that you were talking about, and even the last when you said that coming from the field, how exhausting it is when you are involved in the field. Like whenever we talk about ethnography, we talk a lot about reflexivity and distancing, not actually distancing, but kind of being aware where my biases are pitching in. So I want to know, I realize that reflexivity is needed not only while I'm looking at my data, it starts from the point one only, that from which theoretical background or disciplinary understanding I'm entering the field till the end. So if you can just briefly mention few of the stages or just name the reflexivities like that researchers should be mindful of.
I don't know, Sharmila, what are the types. So I haven't actually thought so deeply about reflexivity. I mean, one has to be, but frankly, at this point of time, I'm getting a bit tired of reflexivity. Yeah.
I asked this because you started saying the same thing, and and because I can relate to that. It's never ending kind of thing. Then everything start become dubious. Oh, so this is also.
It's not so much dubiousness, but somehow I feel that this whole reflexivity business, as Nidhi was summarizing it, it's kind of centers on our reality. And so it's the whole exercise of the field seems to be more for us to understand our world rather than the world that we are researching. So I feel that there is some, I don't know, we have to engage with it a lot more to get out of this ethical bind, I feel. There is a kind of I feel that there is an ethical problem in this. I have not wrapped my head around it yet to think it through. And frankly, I don't want another catharsis. It's like catharsis. How you have to deal with this. Let's think it through. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also true. That like when I was in field and my work was on social class and in schools, me as well as my participants at different stages, we felt like we are reliving, and sometimes they said that they never thought about it from that viewpoint, but when they have talked to me about it, now they have started thinking about it, which at times made me more kind of anxious that am I making something, like am I pushing them to think in a particular direction? Maybe they were at peace before talking about it.
Yes. Absolutely. I think those are ethical questions, not just reflexivity questions, right? I mean, and that's the reason why I feel that we must have a very, it's not just humility, but we need to really understand the responsibility of entering into the field. It's a hugely, we become immensely responsible. We have to be to the field. It's a sense that is not about reflexivity, I think. It's about an ethical responsibility to the field, and let's not forget it that qualitative research works because we build relations. That is, we really operate this quasi-friend-like relationship. And that's the reason why people talk to us and share their life stories with us, right? Because we establish this relationship which mimics that of friendship. But is it friendship? And do we truly act to the field like we do with our friends? I mean, do we continue to maintain these relationships after we have left the field? I think this is a huge burden and a responsibility that we have. And we must, I think, become more conscious of this, I feel. And I think that at least now the whole question of the ethics of research is becoming very, very clear. And it's very well articulated, especially in quantitative, because there that it's a contract between you and your subject, right? They know that they're signing up for 1 hour of interview and they've agreed to it. But in qualitative, what have people signed up for? Did you even ask them if they were signing up to be talked to? No, right? So the whole methodology is very, very subversive. I mean, there's some element of subterfuge. I mean, I don't want to get into again, some breast beating about the ethics of it type of mode. But I think the sense of responsibility, I feel, is something which we must talk about more in our community, not to kind of go into some kind of spiritual round turnabout, but nevertheless, I think, and I think we're also becoming aware of it more and more as we research communities like ours. I think the whole discourse was less there before because there was this power hierarchy within which anthropologists researched the primitives, right? So then that burden was not there. And anyway, it was ultimately for your good types. I think today we can be more conscious about some of these responsibilities. And I think maybe we introduce more ethical terms and not just reflexivity, which seems to be more self-obsession. Right?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're running behind schedule, but I also see 2 hands. Is it okay if we send these questions to Padma, if we can collate them and she can respond to them? Is that all right with those who've raised their hands? Because we're running behind schedule. Okay, then I think I'm doing this housekeeping and I'm bad at it. Okay, thanks, Jyoti. Ritesh will send your question across. I'm so sorry to be doing this to you. Thank you, Padma, for your deep humility, for your honest probing of research, and how honestly you come across. And there is just looking at research with that lens. It's so fresh. It's always fresh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll now go on with the rest of the program.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Apologies, I won't stay for the rest of this really interesting session, but I look forward to reading from the other presenters and engaging.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So maybe one of us will share a brief summary as well as the questions. I'll try to do that.
No brief summary, thick descriptions only.
Okay, detailed descriptions. I'll begin my note taking now in my tense mode. Okay, thanks, Padma. Thank you everything for you do, and thank you for being here. We're all very, very happy.
I think we will take the program forward now, and we had a very enriching session with Professor Padma Sarangpani. We will not keep waiting our next speaker for the day, who's Dr. Anuradha Sharma. And to introduce her to the participants, I would like to invite Dr. Jyoti Dalal.
Yeah, thanks, Deepti. We welcome Dr. Anuradha Sharma. Thank you, Dr. Anuradha, for taking out time to be here with us. Dr. Anuradha Sharma teaches sociology at Jesus and Mary College. Her doctoral research was an ethnographic study of a school in Delhi, where she examined students' experiences of schooling when it is seen through the lens of class, gender, and religion. Some of the questions that we were looking at in this particular session also with Professor Padma. She has published this work in her book School Worlds, and of course she has her other publications also on school education and on sociology. So we are delighted to have you here with us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Dr. Anuradha Sharma.
Thank you, Jyoti, for this sweet introduction. I quickly just want to first thank Dr. Padma for really bringing up very, very pertinent questions. And I mean, we can't imagine, like these are really serious, important questions that are on the horizon for research, for social scientists. And I think probably mostly in India, I think we have been slightly more oblivious to the importance of the relevance of the quantitative research and to a certain extent, like most of our training in social sciences has been mostly qualitative oriented. So I think it's immensely important to bring up these questions. And not only she raised those important questions, but also, provided very, very valuable insights. I can't tell you, like each word was so valuable. I mean, she has really shared a rich experience and really shared really important details about how to go about it, as well as what are the gaps in this. And I'm really thankful for that. It was really a pleasure to listening to her. And she was so succinct in all this. That's important. Yeah, so coming to my presentation now, I think again, a disclaimer, you just might find it several notches below what you just heard. And I'm a sociologist by training. I'm very excited about schools and more so excited about children, basically. So that was an avenue for me to find a way to talk, listen and talk, to work on the thoughts of children, and school was one avenue for me. So that's the route I had taken. And some of what I discussed might be very familiar to you already. So I apologize for that kind of a pedestrian kind of a thing, probably. But let's see if you find it somewhat informative and important. So I'll be sharing a PowerPoint presentation. And just a second, please. Yeah, so this is the context of what I'll be talking about. So school as a social site, understanding formation of social identity in schools. And what I will be talking about are three quick segments. I'll be talking about school as a social site of construction of students' identities, and in that, ethnography as a research tool, very briefly. And then I'll share some insights that I have from my school research experience with you. Now, this is something which you may be already quite familiar with as students who have exposure to schools and who have an orientation from your education perspective as well. And then I quickly touch upon some of the methodological issues related to conceptualizing about identities specifically, and also on the tool of ethnography as such. And some of it might have some resonances with what Dr. Padma just discussed, but like very, very much minor, much briefer, and much less informed, I would say. So a quick background of where I conducted this research, a very, very brief background of that. So this was an ethnography conducted during the years 2011-12 of a private co-educational secondary school in Delhi. And this was a kind of a late shift school or a secondary shift school for economically less privileged children. And my work focused on all the class and age groups. Class, I mean the sections, the classes, I mean the first, second standards, that's what. And age groups, and studied boys as well as girls. So it was not specific to a particular group as such. I studied the school culture as a whole. The administrative structure of this particular school has three key figures in it: a chairman, the principal, and a headmistress of the school. And I just felt like sharing this with you, that permission was relatively easy to get, but establishing a trusted relation with the faculty members took some time. This is pointing out to a very often repeated issue with ethnographic research, the issue of establishing trust with the respondents and with the people in the field. One is always looked at with some suspicion as to why are they here eventually. And it is also slightly, I don't know, like Dr. Padma had mentioned that you get tired by being in the field. I would add to that you get apologetic. I used to feel quite apologetic for, peering into their lives all the while. And in fact, after every 4 or 5 days, I would take a day off so that just to get over that guilt of peering into their everyday lives. And yeah, it depends on the personhood of the researcher as well. I'm somebody who'd be very shy of finding out, being inquisitive about the people. So this research experience was also overcoming some of my own barriers to connecting with people. The fieldwork lasted for a few months and comprised of basically observation, some participation, some informal interviews, and questionnaires, which were mostly open-ended. So questionnaire was another thing that is slightly distinct, which is typically used in a quantitative research mostly, but I really wanted to use this. And actually, I could go on about some of these choices, but I like stick to the key issue at hand, which is identity construction and some discussions of methodological challenges of doing ethnography. But I'll just quickly pitch in with one sentence over here that questionnaires I thought would be a good way of, overcoming some of the presumptions of how ethnographies should be done, because ethnographies require an engagement with the field and with the people in the field. And I just thought that why not just introduce something where I'm not directly present and let them think of responses and let them respond to it when I'm not looming large over their heads and asking them straight face-to-face questions. I thought that would be a more, it gives them more time to think and respond. And I just like to add one more thing, that the questionnaires were kept anonymous so that they could have free self-expression, whatever they thought. So now I come to the second section where I talk about the school as a social site of construction of students' identities and ethnography as a research tool. So it will be a mix of how ethnography has helped me gather these aspects and what is it about school which acts as a site of construction of students' selves. So in this work, I have very specifically focused on the experiences of the students. It is not a work on it does not talk much about the perspective of the teachers very specifically. I mean, the teachers' perspectives comes in, but from the context of the students' experiences primarily. So the students have been prioritized in this study. And I have tried to understand their self-perception on three aspects of their identity. And again, quickly, I would like to add that, retrospectively now, after so many years, when I look back at this work, there are so many things that, could have been done differently. And I value what we did during that time, but there's so many things, you can think of improving on. And so, so basically, we focused on three aspects. It was class, social class, religion, and on gender. Like we looked at three aspects of how students' identities are being constituted along these three parameters. And the idea of identity as a process of becoming has been primarily taken up to be the central way. So the notion of identity has a very strong, it has been very differently conceptualized in a Marxian context, where it is somewhat more stable, somewhat more given for all times, and somewhat more structured, connected to the larger structures. And in this particular work, it has been more of an interpretive stance, a more post-structuralist stance, whereby identity is seen as a process of becoming and not a forever kind of a given thing. And it is in the everyday performatives that the identity is being created, altered, and recreated. And even as I talk about the process of identity as a process of becoming, I would certainly acknowledge that I was mindful of the fact that I was here definitely not really referring to the larger structural principles in the way a Marxian orientation would have expected it to be. And I'm mindful of that. I'm not negating that at all. I'm very mindful of that. It's just that this is another way of looking at the whole process, and it is no less important. It's quite important. It's quite significant. And some of neo-Marxist works have been looking at this element as well in a certain way. But this is also a parallel discussion of the relationship between social structure and human agential action. So I've tried to link it to some way to the larger structural issues as well, but though the ethnography as such has not really explored the larger structural aspects of this identity construction, it has been more on the element of how human beings as agents are trying to figure out or trying to negotiate their own space in this larger social structure. So we'll be focusing more on the processual aspect of it. We'll be focusing more on the micro contexts of identity construction. And so any discussion of agential action will incorporate a reference to identity construction. Any reference to who am I as an agent in this? What action will I take? What stance would I have is somewhat related to who I think I am. So in that sense, the agential action is also deeply connected to the idea of identity construction. But I'll be focusing more on the identity construction as such rather than on the agential aspects. But they're not really too differentiated. There'll be elements where they do interact with each other. So in this work, identities have been seen from the post-structuralist perspective, like in feminist perspective, I've referred to Bronwyn Davis's work, and in class perspective, I've looked at Diane Ray's work, which emphasizes on the processual nature of identity constitution. So what I observed to be some of the specific locations of such a construction in the school were, again, this is going to be very familiar terrain for all of you probably, quite likely. Teachers' perception of the students' class and gender. So I wanted to look at how school as a site of social construction of students' identities operates. And I think that the teacher's perception of who these students are in terms of their class and gender would play an important role in such an identity negotiation. How the students interacted with their teachers, that was another space which would have contributed to some kind of an identity creation, recreation of the students. And another important element was students' perception of their teachers' signs given off. Like maybe the teachers were not overtly expressing their perceptions, but they were sometimes just signs given off. Like sometimes they would say or have some expression which would just, present a different worldview to the students of what their teachers thought of them. So those were also important things, very subtle ways. And then I'll touch upon very briefly on administrators' visualization of who these students are. And again, very briefly on students' interaction with the peers in the school setting. I'd like to mention here that students' interaction with their peers is not, okay, I'll come to that later. Let's go. So the schools are a potentially significant site of construction of identity or certain aspects of identity. And these are often a site of interaction of the self that the students bring to the school and their experiences at the school. It's an interaction of the self that the students bring to the school and of what they experience at the school. And ethnography is one of the best suited tools for capturing these nuanced interactions. It's a best suited tool because the ethnographic method provides access to the utterances and the tones of the voices, the facial expressions, the body language, and the silences. More importantly, a lot can be known by paying attention to the moments of transition. Those moments of transition that Professor Padma was also referring to, like there will be a lull, there will be a routine kind of an observation, and suddenly something happens where things are changing, shifting. I think those are the important moments that only ethnography is capable of capturing. Those are the moments of transitions, like how that decision was being taken, was taken, why was it taken, what was the decision. Subtle choices of acting or not acting in a certain way, and some unself-conscious expressions are some of the, so these two are most important, like facilitating access to unself-conscious expressions and to moments of making a choice. These are the two most salient gifts of the ethnographic method, which I think, I don't think how any other method can replicate, can replace, can replace this kind of facilitation that ethnographic method allows. So now I come to some insights from my school research experience, like some concrete instances of how and what did I see there. So first we discussed the gendered selves. The stereotypes of gendered selves were reinforced in some interactions and were challenged in another. So it was not a unilinear kind of observation. It was both the things were happening there simultaneously. So the older students were much more self-consciously practicing socially expected gender behavior, but that could be something which they are bringing from their home environment as well. Which I want to see how the schools space was dealing with that thing. The boisterous boys and the demure girls stereotype was quite evident among the older students, and mostly teachers did not challenge that, at least in an overt way. There were never ever any discourses on how girls should be also more proactive, or how boys should be, more respectful of girls and basically more gentle and well-mannered and all those kinds of things. There were no such overt discourses ever. However, the school did offer avenues to break free from these stereotypes, and was also a space of reinforcement of these in some other ways. The official discourse of school pedagogy worked towards challenging the stereotypes. So the official stance of the school was definitely towards challenging these stereotypes. So one measure for that was by actively prioritizing girl students during admissions. The other way through which the stereotypes were challenged by was through the behavior of the teachers in the classroom, where most of them did not discriminate by the usual patterns. I really looked hard at some instance where the gender discrimination would take place, in terms of, like, typically we read about how the teachers would allow boys to respond more to the questions, or she would be more encouraging of boys making boys attempting to answer the questions and those kinds of things. But here, none of that was. I didn't observe any of that in many of my classrooms. I mean, teachers were not really discriminatory in that sense of the terms, and girls were equally responsive to the teachers' questions as were boys. So that was a heartening thing to see. I was happy that I didn't see any of that, at least in this form. And another way in which the stereotype was being challenged was in the girls doing very well in math and science. The girls were not really, I asked them what is your favorite subject and science, and here it's another important thing to note is that neither the students and nor the teachers make it to be an extraordinary thing. Nobody said that. I mean, I in my heart was feeling very glad that girls were really. Girls were very comfortable in math and science, but I think the teachers or the students were not really, they were not really, they didn't see it as a major thing, because, and in that sense, I think it's a normalization of this acceptance of this notion, and I think it's a major important thing, because it's not like that somebody would say, oh, you're a girl, how come you like maths? Or you're a girl, how come you are good in science? None of that was ever heard, which was, again, I would consider it to be a normalization of this, it was actually a dismantling of a stereotype in one way. The playground was another field where the opportunities for reinforcement and challenging the stereotypes played out quite often. I've written extensively in my work on this area, but here I'll be touching upon it very briefly. So basically, while the older children did have some distinction between the girls' sports and the boys' sports, where the boys will be more engaging in more sporty activities in the field during the break and otherwise, while the girls would be mostly chatting in groups and maybe playing some very less robust games. But mostly the distinction was not very prominent in the school playground activities as well. And of course, the younger children were much more free of these concerns. So the school atmosphere didn't really discourage girls who were being very active in the sports field in any way. And so basically, it was mostly left to the students what they would do to engage in some interesting sports, more masculine sports, as they are called, football, etc. Then there was nothing stopping them. And sports day also saw girls heartily participating in the events. So I think the school was at least consciously not trying to impose any additional stereotypes, or was not really raising any barriers in this area. However, the cultural activities was one area which was slightly less present to the stereotyping that is inherent in the projections of masculinities and femininities. Although the teacher or the teachers who were involved in these cultural activities were themselves very progressive, and they were very enabling. One of the most enabling teachers that I saw in the school. But somehow the context of the cultural activities, maybe dance and music, wasn't really helping in challenging the stereotypes. But it was not supporting those as well in a very categorical way. A cultural performance for annual day. This is also again something I've discussed in detail in my work. So the cultural performance for annual day was pretty thoughtful. It was full of very value-based, ideas, and it was very educative and was creative as well. But the gender distinctions were not consciously challenged. For example, the bad was shown through the boys, and it was only the boys who were shown to be potentially harmful, potentially strong, while the girls or the women figures in the dramas were mostly shown to be, docile, intelligent, but not strong, and not very aggressive. So those were the ways in which it could have really helped the students refigure their gender identities, but it didn't really support the stereotypes too much, but it didn't even challenge them also. That's what I would say. So most of the times, the formal approach of the teachers was conscious of the need to not discriminate among the students on the basis of gender. But when it came to informal discussions, some of them themselves had quite conventional views on how women and men are inherently different. So this was when I was with them in the staff room and when they were discussing their other matters. So yeah, again, slightly guilty of, listening to all the details, but then this is what came out. Like they were conscious of being gender sensitive when they were interacting with their students as teachers, but when it came to informal discussions, many of the teachers had very conventional views on how men and women are inherently different. So this minor distinction and thin distinction between the formal conscious attempts and the informal subconscious thoughts was made accessible due to the ethnographic engagement with the field. So here I want to point out that was it not for my ethnographic, method, I might have missed out on this. The school did not explicitly encourage, but in the unsupervised moments, the conventional beliefs about gender expectations would manifest sometimes. For example, they were preparing for the annual day event, and the teacher called for 2 tall boys. Any of the 2 tall boys, please come with me so that we can, collect some things from the attic or whatever. So she didn't say 2 tall students. She said 2 tall boys. So in that way, there was some minor, So the other thing was class identity. The school's foundation as a space for economically underprivileged children as its students makes it an important site for analyzing its impact on the class identity of the students. So this was a much negotiated area of self-perception. If I sum it very briefly, wherever it became very obvious that the students' class identity was being underlined, it was met with resistance from the students. So wherever they felt that their class identity was being referred to, they didn't take it very kindly. And while many teachers and as well as the administrators were mostly supportive of the agenda of the school, and they were committed to providing an opportunity to their students, there were instances where inadvertently the class background of the students acted as a barrier in the path to an unbiased pedagogical experience. There was an instance that almost dramatically brought out this tension. So in one class, the special privileges available for the underprivileged students were being discussed, and the teacher happened to refer to her students as an example. I found it very, very jarring, but that's what had happened. By her overt demeanor, she wasn't intending to humiliate them. She was otherwise a very, very reasonable person. But this example suddenly, put a question on that. But her reference to her students as underprivileged did not do much good as far as an equalizing or enabling pedagogy is concerned. The response of the students was equally remarkable. They refused to acknowledge themselves as being underprivileged. They used third-person reference to reflect the projection. They responded by using such children as an expression. They refused to be considered as those underprivileged children by the teacher. They said, yeah, such children are hugely benefited by such schools. So they deflected the whole attempt to identify them as those underprivileged children. And the resistance to being considered as receivers of some charity was very prominent among the students. Whenever such a projection emerged from a high stand, whenever somebody tried to take a high stand, students were very present to negate that. Most of the times, the school avoided promoting such practices or behaviors. But it is important to mention that when not pressed for acknowledgement, the students appreciated the efforts of their school for them. So when they were not being pointed out to be somebody who's in need of help, that's when they will acknowledge, appreciate the efforts of the school for them. Another classroom interaction is worth mentioning here. This reflects on a dramatic shift in the responses of the students because of the approach of the teacher. I'd just like to mention briefly here that this also sets me thinking that by such observations, we are probably also putting a lot of burden on the teacher. And it is the sole responsibility of the teacher to, invoke, interest in the students. I think that, we can take that with a pinch of salt. At the same time, the importance of the teacher as a mediator is not really is not to be missed. So basically, we have to be mindful of both the facts that we shouldn't be holding the teacher responsible for what the students do all the time. And suppose they do well in the class, it's not the sole responsibility of the teacher. It could be related to so many other factors. Class, for example, one thing. But at the same time, we cannot be unmindful of the fact that he or she do have an important role to play as mediators of a new being. So the same group of students were quiet to the extent of being non-responsive in one class, while with the change of the teacher in the next hour, this was completely changed. There was a palpable, visible difference in the attitude of the students with two different teachers. So whenever any teacher gave off a subtle sign that they think that these students are probably not capable of achieving great success in learning, the students caught that and responded likewise. Or they just, some of them just went back into that shell. But if a teacher did not think of them as being from a certain class, they mostly responded as any other student, not held back by the perceptions of them being from a lesser privileged class. They would behave like any other potential student. Most of the time, students were very grateful for the opportunity that the school has provided them, and this was mostly recorded in the questionnaires that they responded to. I didn't ask them direct questions. Are you grateful for the school? I asked them indirect questions, and I asked them to respond anonymously. So in that way, I'm quite certain that what they were expressing was quite reflective of what they were really thinking, because they were not under any pressure to write good things about the school. Some of them did mention briefly like some problems with it, but then mostly they were pretty grateful for this. And I didn't ask them direct questions. It was like a lot of different questions that I asked through which I gathered this information. So it is not that they were in denial of their class identity through the resistances they showed when put down, but they would not take it as a school because the school for them was the space for a potential upward mobility. So they didn't want to sabotage that by any chance. So their appreciation for school is actually an acknowledgement of the opportunity that the school provides them, and any attempt by anyone, by intention or by unintention, sabotaging that possibility was definitely resisted. So, they resisted it because they thought that this is the space where we can hope for something and you don't mess with it. Now, religion as an area of identity was not really, this school was not really that space which would have contributed to that aspect of identity, because it was not it was not affiliated to any particular religious sect or group. And I deliberately took up religion as one of the aspects of identity. I wanted to see how does school potentially impact the religious identity of the students if it is not a religiously affiliated school. Like, does it still have some hope, or does it not hope? Does it still have a potential to influence the religious identities of the students? So the academic spaces of the classroom teaching, sports activities, and informal interactions did not have any opportunities for discussions on and around religion. But the cultural activities again were to some extent spaces where this did emerge. The school did not subscribe to any particular religious ideology, but in its cultural activities, it did derive from the philosophical meanings sourced from religion. So, as I already mentioned, the music and dance teachers were very much committed to bringing value-based education to the children, but they didn't subscribe to any one particular religion as a source for it. But they definitely acknowledged the importance of spirituality and philosophical contributions of religion in making us a better human being. So that was unmistakably there. The value of religion as a source of inspiration and a broader vision for upliftment of humanity would be sometimes acknowledged. The speeches of the administrators were often drawing inspiration from such thoughts. They would often refer to these things, but in very subtle ways. They would not be referring to any particular religious ideology as such. The school was not really playing a very prominent role in impacting the religious selves of the students, but it very subtly continued to acknowledge the benevolent aspects of any religious thought. So it was not really committed to becoming more scientific or secular at the cost of giving up this supposedly important aspect of religion. So it was somewhere in between. Quick note on the administrators, because the fact that these administrators were like this, that the school was a space for these students to renegotiate their identities to some extent. So basically the three people were mostly in consonance with the goal of the school as a space of opportunity for the economically underprivileged children. The ways in which each one played their respective roles was different, but the underlying thought was in consensus. Chairman facilitated the resources. The school was never short of any resources in terms of benches and spaces or other facilities or computers for the students. The principal encouraged administrative freedom to the headmistress and had inspirational views and vision for the students' growth. His speeches were quite inspirational and quite warm and very authentic and very from the heart. And he really was very much present to the upliftment of the students. And the headmistress was a person who saw immense potential in encouraging aesthetics and creative aspects of the students. And I would like to mention here that she did not think that these students are from so poor background. I mean, how would they care for aesthetics? She didn't have an iota of that feeling in her. I mean, she was one of the most evolved persons that I have come across after several years. And her overall demeanor towards the teachers as well as the students was a strong factor in creating an enabling atmosphere in the school. She was not hard on the teachers as well, but she was very mindful of if there's something being done which was not supposed to be done in the school, like somebody being overly, disciplinarian or somebody being overly unruly. She would take note of that and she would counsel them, but she was not harsh at any moment that I was there. Like, she was very a kind person. She did not have any biases or apprehensions about the capabilities of the students. She didn't even go to the extent of denying the possibilities. She didn't even mention that we need to bring these students up and do something for them. She just took it for granted that, yes, this has to be done. But she was mindful of the hardships that these students have to endure. But the way she used to speak about these problems, it was clear that she was not full of those ideas that some teachers would talk very often of how ultimately these students have to go back to homes which are like difficult and broken. She usually did not. She never referred to their backgrounds as that. He just said that we should understand that these are the students who have to face hardships. So I think that background of that administrative perspective really gave the confidence to the students that this school is committed to some kind of upliftment for them. And and peer interactions can be seen more as a playing out of the self in the school. It would be like a canvas where the students would be checking out how they're changing or how they're doing. In another context, peer interactions has actually been discussed in much more detail in my work. But in this context, I feel it is more in relation to how they were acting out their selves with each other rather than learning from each other more so. And